So when I was making this video, when I started writing it, I was fresh off the back of making my disturbing short stories iceberg video, and I had a ton of fun with that. And after making kind of a longer video that requires a lot of time and research, I will typically make something more niche that requires a little bit less research. And I spent the day just kind of sitting around and wondering what to cover next. I looked at my bookshelf and thought of the books that I'd read recently and kind of floated a couple ideas, but nothing was really calling out to me, so I'm making another video about a Weenies book. Now you might be hearing the term Weenies books and think that the stories inside of them are probably all kiddie stories that might not be your thing, and I get that. That's what I thought when I first found the books, but there are some seriously freaky stories in this book that you won't want to miss. If you're a fan of the channel, then you know that I absolutely adore the Weenies series by David Lubar. They are collections of short horror stories intended to be read by kids, but they're often really freaky, and a lot of them creep me out more as an adult rather than when I was a kid and I read them in elementary school. This video is going to be structured very similarly to my disturbing short stories video, my other iceberg videos, so if you enjoy hearing me go into in-depth on a bunch of different books or stories, then you'll probably enjoy this video as well. It's pretty much the same thing. I will be covering all 35 stories found in The Curse of the Campfire Weenies in this video. I've previously covered a couple of these in another video that I made a while back, and I will be covering them again in this video. I just want to make sure that you guys got the complete experience of this book, and I didn't want to leave anything out, especially since the stories that I covered in that other video are some of my favorites. Remember to subscribe if you haven't yet. My new sub goal for this year is 50,000 subs, so by the end of 2025. That'll be a really big stretch for the channel, but I think I can get it done with your guys' help. The support so far has been amazing. But enough yapping from me. Let's explain and review all 35 stories in David Lubar's The Curse of the Campfire Weenies. Spoilers ahead. Mr. Hoo-Ha is a story that I've talked about on this channel before, but it's just so great. It's one of my favorites in the entire series. It's about a kid named Andrew that says he is almost entirely fearless. He isn't scared of any monsters or horror movies or anything like that, but he is terrified of clowns. Now, this isn't usually an issue. Andrew doesn't run into clowns on a daily basis, but his little brother is having a birthday party, and Andrew's mom insists that they hire a clown named Mr. Hoo-Ha. Andrew protests against this, and he says that he can entertain his brother's friends just fine. But his mom says that they are hiring Mr. Hoo-Ha no matter what, and Andrew tries to skip out on the party, but his mom insists that he attend so he can help her out with all the other kids. He sets up the party and tries to skip out after that, but then the doorbell rings and his mom asks him to go get it. He opens the door to find Mr. Hoo-Ha, and he looks just like any other clown, but this is enough to really creep Andrew out, although he tries not to show it. Mr. Hoo-Ha comes inside and entertains the kids, and Andrew gets a brilliant idea. He says that his little brother used to be scared of the vacuum until Andrew opened it up and showed him exactly how it worked. Once his brother saw that it was just a simple machine, he wasn't scared anymore, and Andrew wants to do something similar for himself. He sneaks out to the van that Mr. Hoo-Ha arrived in and waits for the clown to finish up inside. The clown leaves the party and gets into his van, and Andrew watches from right outside the window to see Mr. Hoo-Ha take his makeup off. If he can see him transform from a clown back to a normal man, then he won't be scared anymore. So he watches Mr. Hoo-Ha as he takes his makeup off. He takes off his big rubber clown nose, and underneath it unrolls a thin, long, flattened nose like a tiny elephant's trunk. He takes off his wig to reveal a transparent membrane that you can see his brains through. He peels off his big red lips that weren't painted on, but rather plastic lips. They hide a gumless clutter of jagged brown teeth. He pulls off his gloves and reveals his boneless white fingers that look like bloated worms, and he pulls off his shoes, but Andrew can't see what they hide underneath. Having made his horrifying transformation, Mr. Hoo-Ha pulls away from the curb and speeds off. Andrew walks back inside his house and shudders, not really believing what he just saw, and his younger brother comes up to him and hugs his leg, saying that he doesn't really like clowns anymore and thinks they're kind of scary. Andrew says, "You got that right," and his brother says that they're big boys though, and big boys don't get scared. And Andrew says that big boys get scared too, they just learn to hide it. This is a really perfect first story in my opinion. It starts with something really freaky that you have to imagine yourself. The descriptions that David Lubar gives for the different body parts of Mr. Hoo-Ha are really effective, and I can picture them so clearly in my mind. I also love that it ends with Andrew saying that everybody gets scared, they just learn to hide it better. It's almost a way for the author to comfort any of the young readers who are reading one of his books for the first time. If you're scared by these stories, that's alright, everybody gets scared. I think these books are brilliant for readers of all ages. I loved them when I was younger, and I really love them now as an adult. Obviously, I've read books that are far more scary than these stories, but David Lubar's strength comes from his inventiveness. His ideas are always really unique. I would pay good money to have an illustrator illustrated version of these books done in the style of Stephen Gammell's illustrations for scary stories to tell in the dark, it would be absolutely horrifying in just the best way possible. You Are What You Eat is a more silly story than a scary one. It seems that they try to balance out the freaky stuff with some other stories that are just kind of funny. In this story, we have our main kid and Dale, who are looking through the old food in Dale's garage. Dale offers the main kid $5 if he eats an old can of baby food, and the kid thinks about it for a second, and then he just opens up the old can, dips his fingers into the sludge and eats it, and he immediately drops to the ground and is confused. Dale looks down at him, and the two of them realize that the kid has been turned into a baby. He tries to say something, but he can't get any words out. He doesn't even have any teeth anymore, and he immediately pees himself since he doesn't have control over his body. They both realize that it must have been the baby food that turned him into a baby, and Dale goes back into his house to get something to clean the pee off of the ground while the baby kid just crawls around and looks for something that can turn him back. He eventually finds a can of manwich and manages to get it open and eat some, and this turns him into a man that towers over Dale. He then tells Dale to clean up the mess, takes his $5 and looks for something to feed him, maybe more baby food, cat food, or maybe even goat cheese. So yeah, this one is just kind of funny. I do find something kind of existentially terrifying about the idea of turning into a baby specifically. I remember that me and my brothers used to talk about like what we would do if all of a sudden you like woke up from reality and realized that you were back in like second grade and everything that you had lived had been a dream up to that point. That idea has always kind of freaked me out. I don't know why, but the idea of having to start over or realizing that all your relationships with your friends or family were just a dream is something that I still think about from time to time. That's not exactly what this story is about, but there is a theme in these books where kids are turned into something else, and those stories always get to me. Maybe it's just me though, and you guys don't really get what I'm talking about at all. Spin is another one of my favorites, and the first one that really introduces us to a major theme through most of these stories, and that is terrible kids. This story is about a 5-year-old kid named Jimmy and his jerk of an older brother, and Jimmy is special for one particular reason. He can spin things. I guess I should say that he can make things spin with his mind. He can look at any object and make it spin around in place. His older brother Darren is constantly annoyed by this and always tries to get him to stop. The story starts with Darren being forced to bring Jimmy to the park with him. Darren yanks Jimmy by the arm painfully and takes him to the park. On the way, he stops by his friend Ray's house and brings him along too. Ray comes out carrying a basketball and offers it to Jimmy, but when Jimmy reaches out for it, he pulls away and laughs at Jimmy, calling him a sucker. The three of them get to the park and the two older kids start to shoot baskets. Jimmy sits around and makes some of the trash at the park spin, which pisses Darren off for some reason. Darren is always really mad at Jimmy for making things spin, and I don't really understand why. Maybe it's just like jealousy. The two older boys grab Jimmy and drag him painfully across the sand. They pick him up and put him on the tallest platform of the play structure so he can't get down on his own, and they begin to walk away, and Jimmy looks for something else to spin. He notices a grain of sand on the platform and puts it in his palm. He says spin, and the grain of sand starts to spin around in his hand, only that isn't the only grain of sand that spins. The sand that's stuck to his shoes begins to spin as well, and they start to tear their way through the soles of his shoes, like grinding it all down. The sand eats its way into his shoes, but thankfully doesn't reach his feet. It keeps spinning though, and then we see that Darren and Ray were on their way back to the basketball court when the spinning started, and they're still on the playground with all the sand. As each individual grain spins and twirls around, Jimmy hears the screams of Darren and Ray as they are painfully shredded to death by the sand on the playground, and the story ends with Jimmy smiling and Ray and Darren's screams stopping. They have nothing left to scream with. I love this story. The idea is very unique, and being shredded alive by sand sounds incredibly painful. I'm a rock climber that almost exclusively boulders indoors, and the gym that I used to climb at had texture walls that almost felt like sandpaper. I have shredded the skin off of my fingers so many times while rock climbing, and it is never a pleasant experience. I can't imagine how painful it would be to be shredded alive all the way. It's a fantastic story that leaves just enough up to the imagination. I also thought I should explain a term that I use that might have sounded like strange to a lot of you guys. I'm from Washington, and here we call like the big jungle gym play fort things at a playground play structures. I didn't know that was like a uniquely PNW thing until my wife pointed out that she had like never heard that term before, being from Colorado. So if you use the term play structure, then let me know, because I don't know if it's just like a Washington, Oregon thing, but like everybody here calls them play structures. So tell me what you guys call them. The Tunnel of Terror is about a girl named Rachel who is at an amusement park with her two friends. Her friends want to ride the Tunnel of Terror, but Rachel is scared. They convince her to ride, and the two friends get into one of the ride vehicles, leaving Rachel to catch the next one alone. Rachel asks the guy operating the ride if it's scary, and he says, "We always give you what you pay for." She gets on the ride and enters a dark hallway where she can't see the car in front of her anymore, and from the darkness, a skull pops out and scares her. She sees a man with an axe and his eye dangling from its socket, and it looks like strangely lifelike to her, and at this point, Rachel can't take it any longer, so she shuts her eyes and puts her head down until the ride is over, and then she sees the brightness of daylight and opens her eyes. She gets off the ride, and her friends say that it wasn't that scary. Rachel agrees and looks over at the ride operator, who is covering his eyes in like a mocking sort of way. Rachel looks back at her friend to see that her hair is white and tangled and the skin is rotting off of her face. She panics and turns away to see a man impaled on a tree branch, his dead body dripping blood. Rachel's friends ask her what's wrong. They can't really see what she is seeing, and she continues to look around and see horrifying sights around her, and then comes to a realization. The ride operator told her that you always get what you pay for in the Tunnel of Terror. She decides to keep her eyes open and look at all the horrifying sights, wondering just how long this ride will last. This one is also really cool. The idea being that she shut her eyes on the ride, so now she essentially has to make up for that lost time in the real world by seeing horrifying, twisted versions of the world around her. It's a really unique idea, and I had honestly forgotten about this story, but I'm glad I reread it because this is like one of my new favorites. A Nice Clean Place is another funny story. This one is about a girl named Steffi that has to walk through the west side of town every day. The entire west side is filthy, but especially the park that she cuts through in order to avoid some creepy boys. She says that the park is covered in trash, and even worse, there are pigeons all over the place that poop on everything. She mentions a statue in the park that is covered in so much bird poop that you could poke it with your finger and it would sink up to the knuckle before you hit stone. Gross. One day, Steffi is walking behind the statue and she falls into a deep hole that she didn't realize was there. She lands on a nice clean hill and is approached by a man who welcomes her to the underside of the town. This is like just another section of the town that has people living there, and he gives her a tour and she notices that everything is perfectly clean. When the tour is over, the guide thanks her for visiting and says that they almost never get visitors since the entrance to their world, being the hole behind the statue, is hidden so well, and Steffi asks him how they keep their world so clean, and he shows her their secret. He pulls out a gum wrapper and throws it on the floor, and immediately a pigeon flies down, eats the wrapper, and flies up through the hole to the top side of the city, and he says that someone invented pigeons that eat garbage and then poop it out topside. Steffi leaves the underside of the city and looks around at all the trash and poop, and she takes a big rock and places it over the entrance to the underside so the pigeons can't escape and poop in her world. She says that those undersiders can take care of their own problems and throws a piece of trash away, and she says it's not much, but it's a start. I've noticed that sometimes David Lubar will write stories with some like environmentalist messaging in a really kind of unique and clever way. This one is like kind of pointing to the fact that a lot of places like the US and other countries just kind of like ship our garbage to other countries or throw it into the ocean and make someone else deal with it. I really like this story. These books are great at like building up mythologies or worlds in just a couple pages. I think the mark of a good short story is that you'll feel just a little unsatisfied because you want to explore more of the world of the story. They should make you imagine what else could happen if the story was expanded into a full novel. Tied Up is one of the longer stories in this book, and it's really interesting. It's about a kid who is currently playing on the 98th inning of his baseball game that is far longer than any baseball game has ever gone on. Our main kid is up to bat, but the game keeps getting tied, and so they have to continue adding on extra innings. He sees a man selling hot dogs, and he rushes over to him to get one, and he asks his friend if he knows when the game will end, and he says that he doesn't know. The kid starts to think about how he got to the game, and he realizes that he can't really remember the game ever starting. He starts to think harder and remembers being in his room and eating a hot dog. He was getting ready for his Little League game. He leaned over to tie his shoes and remembered that he couldn't breathe, and he woke up in the baseball field and has been playing ever since. He asks his coach when the game will be over, and the coach says that he was hoping that the kid would have the answer to that question. The coach has his neck twisted and a bone that looks out of place. The kid says that instead of wearing a normal belt, the coach is wearing a seatbelt, and the kid realizes that he and everyone else are in some sort of purgatory, and all of them are on the verge of death. Then, from out of nowhere, he feels someone grab him around the waist and push hard in his chest, and he immediately coughs up a hot dog that he choked on and finds himself back in his room with his dad holding him. His dad has performed the Heimlich maneuver on him because he was worried the kid would die. The kid, now free from this purgatory, gets ready to go to his baseball game. He says he's had lots of practice, and he looks on the TV and sees that there was a shooting and a kid was hit. And he recognizes him as his friend from the Eternal Baseball game, but the reporter says the kid has pulled through and will be okay. So the Eternal Baseball game is some sort of like purgatory where those who are on the verge of death play baseball forever, it seems. It could also just be that this is a place where the souls of the dead play baseball, and our main kid and his friend were there because they were technically dead, but then were brought back to life, and that's how they escaped. Definitely an interesting story. I don't know if it needed to be as long as it was. It's seriously one of the longest stories in this book, if not the longest. It has a happy ending, which is pretty rare for these stories, although I am noticing that this book seems to be less bleak than the last one that I covered on this channel. Predators is about a 12-year-old kid who chats online with strangers. That can't be good. Anyways, he says that his username is Kirby12 and that his real name is Danny, but he also says that the 12 part is just sort of accurate. Danny's mom always warns him against talking to strangers on the internet, but Danny just has too much fun doing it. He starts talking to a user named DarkFan43 who encourages Danny to meet up with him in real life, and he says that he's also 12. DarkFan asks if they can meet in the quarry that night, and Danny says that he's not sure about it. His mom wouldn't be okay with it. DarkFan just tells him to sneak out at night, and Danny agrees. And that night, Danny meets DarkFan in the quarry. DarkFan steps out of the shadows and reveals that he lied about his age. He's much older than 12. Danny responds by saying that he's 12, but 12 centuries. And DarkFan looks confused as Danny opens his mouth, showing his fangs glistening in the moonlight. He decides whether to kill DarkFan quickly or whether to chase him around for a while. He chases him around, toying with him before finally killing him and drinking his blood. And he says the internet is certainly a place with a lot of predators on it, and he is doing his part to get rid of them. So this one is a really cool subversion of like the classic predator talking to a child online situation. When you first read it, your heart kind of drops when he meets up with the creepy old predator, but you know the story won't go there because this is supposed to be a kid's book. The vampire angle is a really cool way to tie it all together though. The fact that the kid essentially acts as like a vampire vigilante is really cool, kind of like a cross between Count Dracula and Chris Hansen. Count Chris Hansula. The Curse of the Campfire Weenies is the titular story in this book. I typically don't love the actual like Weenies stories, but this one is pretty good. It's about a brother and sister that are going on a camping trip with their parents and their nerdy neighbor, Mr. Dworkin. I've mentioned this before, but I was actually like a Boy Scout growing up. I actually earned my Eagle Scout and I could tell you pretty much nothing about what I learned. I forgot all of that a long time ago. But anyways, while I was reading this story, it reminded me of some of my camping trips when I was a scout. What the story captures very well is that sometimes you'll have some very well-intentioned adults who want to do everything properly and teach kids how to start a fire with flint and steel and insist on helping you with everything. But kids just want to be kids, and I don't remember a single thing that I learned while camping, but I remember just loving camping. All that to say, Mr. Dworkin is constantly correcting the kids on everything that they're trying to do, and the kids hate it. He ties up all their food in a large picnic blanket and hangs it from a tree so bears can't get to it. He then goes to collect firewood with the two kids, and they roll their eyes at him and say that he always smells like lunch meat. Eventually, they start a fire, and the parents come back from the hike that they went on, and they ask where the burgers are that they brought for dinner, and Mr. Dworkin says he put them in the picnic blanket to be safe from the bears. The issue being that he took the frozen hamburgers from out of the cooler and put them in a hot blanket that's been sitting out in the sun for a couple hours, and now all the food has gone bad, so the parents drive off to find a nearby market so they can get some food. Mr. Dworkin sits with the kids around the fire and pulls out his guitar and begins to sing campfire songs. At this point, the kids have had enough of Mr. Dworkin and they dip. They sneak into the forest and start to wander around looking at all the other campsites. They find a campsite with a weird family with like 10 kids and another campsite of Girl Scouts singing the same annoying song over and over and over again. Eventually they decide that they're actually just better off with Mr. Dworkin and they head back. And he starts to tell them a scary story, and the kids already know the endings to all the scary stories, and he gets upset at this and tells them that they need to respect their elders. He thinks they're just trying to scare him, but a real bear is behind him, like batting at the picnic blanket with the food in it. The kids try to convince Mr. Dworkin that they're telling the truth, but it's no use, so they just run away into the woods. Behind them, they hear the sound of Mr. Dworkin continuing to scold them, but then all they can hear is the sound of him screaming as the bear mauls him and eats him. Definitely one of those stories that is mostly supposed to be funny. There isn't anything even like paranormal in this one, but I just watched Nexpo's video where he talks about the Timothy Treadwell grizzly bear incident, so that's like all I could think about the entire time. This is probably one of the better title stories in the series. It does a good job of being relatable and setting up Mr. Dworkin as kind of being like insufferable, so you don't feel like too bad about his fate in the end, but it's still a little messed up. Catnapped is about a kid named Oswald who goes out into his backyard and finds that his pet cat has caught something and is holding it in her mouth. and it's a leprechaun. The leprechaun is shouting at the cat, telling her to let him go. Oswald tells the leprechaun that he'll get his cat to let him go, but only if the leprechaun gives him a pot of gold. The leprechaun agrees and angrily insults Oswald, and he tells him that he has to provide the pot, and then he'll fill it with the gold. Oswald goes inside and looks for the biggest pot he can find. He sees that his mom is making soup in a large pot, so he dumps the soup out and heads into the backyard. Which, by the way, if I had ever done anything like that, like dump out what my mom was cooking for me when I was younger, it would not have gone over well. But anyway, he takes the pot and he finds his cat in the backyard, but no leprechaun, and he sees a can of tuna sitting on the ground. He realizes that she must have let the leprechaun go herself in exchange for the can of tuna. He calls her a stupid animal and says that she doesn't even have a way to open the can and heads back inside. The leprechaun then reappears with a can opener and thanks the cat, saying that she isn't a dumb animal at all. He leaves the can opener with the cat and disappears, and the cat bats at the can opener for a while but can't get it to work, obviously, because she's a cat. She then goes off in search for some mice to eat, and the story ends with the cat thinking that mice taste better than tuna anyways. So this one's just another fun story. I like how not a single character in this story gets what they want except for the leprechaun. He manages to play both the cat and the kid and get away safely. I had forgotten about this story, and it definitely feels different from what David Lubar usually writes, but it's still a really good time. The Unforgiving tree is one that I covered in a previous video and has a really cool premise. Our main kid gets home from school one day and he notices that a tree that is usually in front of his house has moved. Just barely, but it has moved a little bit. He checks on the tree every day after school and finds that it's moving a tiny bit each day. He tries to find out what direction the tree is moving in, and he sees that it's getting closer to his bedroom window. And one night, a branch crashes through the window and scares him, and his dad thinks that he was the one that broke the window, but he swears it was the tree. Later, he tells his dad that the tree is moving closer to the house, and the dad says that it was just a sapling when they first moved in, and it only looks like it's moving closer because it's just growing. He says that the kid must have always had a fascination with that tree. He talks about how when the kid was younger, the kid stole one of his saws and tried to chop it down, and now our main kid is thinking that the tree is out for revenge, and he goes out to the tree and sees the scar from where he tried to cut it down all those years ago. He asks the tree if he can say that he's sorry to it, and that the tree should probably just let it go, and as he does that, a large branch crashes down, and the kid jumps out of the way just in time to not be crushed. He now sees this tree will not forgive him, so he goes back to the garage to find something to cut it down with, but his parents show up and he gives up. While he is sleeping in his room at night, a branch creeps through the window and wraps itself around the kid's neck, and he pulls out his pocket knife that luckily he has on him while he's sleeping, I guess, and he hacks away at the branch, and it retreats and bleeds some brown sap-like blood. The next day, the parents discover flooding in the basement and realize that the roots of the tree have ruined all the pipes down below. They decide to call some guys to cut the tree down, and with the tree cut down and defeated, the kid can finally celebrate. He talks to his dad, who reminds him of the time that he got a hold of his saw, and he also reminds him of the time that the kid used his pocket knife to carve his initials into every tree in the neighborhood. The kid feels his stomach drop, and he looks around and sees that every tree in the neighborhood seems to be moving just a little bit closer to him. This story is really great. I love the idea of a tree just hating you and holding a grudge. The play on Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree is really clever too. In that story, the tree lets the boy take everything from her, but in this story, the tree never forgives and never forgets. Something that all of these stories do so well is bring me back to being a kid. I don't know if it's just because I read these books for the first time when I was a kid, but I can picture myself in all of these situations. Every story feels like a fear that I would have had back then made manifest. And this story in particular manifests a current fear of mine, which is my pipes flooding and ruining my house. I just had to fix up our toilet by patching up a section of it, and it was not very fun. Bobbing for Dummies features our absolute worst kids yet. This one takes place at a YMCA Halloween party, and two of the older kids go around harassing all of the younger kids, just pushing them down, making fun of them, and pushing their heads down while they're bobbing for apples. The older kids eventually decide that they've had enough of torturing the younger kids, and they sneak off to the pool to go swimming. The pool is closed, but they don't care, and they just get in the water, and then they hear a loud noise above them. The roof of the building is then ripped off by two massive kids that are looking down into the pool. One of them bobs down and tries to bite one of the older kids and misses, and then another kid bobs down and gets one of them, biting them in half. And the story ends with another giant kid bobbing down and eating the remaining bully. This is just classic Weenies material. You have two kids that are just terrible, and they end up facing some sort of karmic justice. The image of the giant kids ripping the roof off and then bobbing down for them is really effective immersive and super eerie while also being pretty funny. I recently started watching Attack on Titan because I've never seen it before, and all I could think of was the Titans like reaching down and grabbing people and eating them. So that's all I was thinking of this entire story. But I like the idea that this story reinforces that there will always be someone bigger than you. I work with middle schoolers, and some of them are just such bullies, but mostly because they're in 8th grade right now. And I always wonder what will happen to them when they go to high school and they aren't on top anymore. These books are really good at teaching messages through really unconventional ways, and I always appreciated it. I mean, I was a quiet nerd for almost all of my public education days, and now I'm a slightly louder nerd that talks to a camera, but I always really liked these stories. Next up, we have Eat a Bug. This story follows Laura, the second loneliest girl in the school. She's out at recess looking for a group to join in on, but there isn't anyone who wants to play with her, and she starts to feel sorry for herself. Although Laura is lonely, she can take some solace in the fact that at least she isn't Debbie Dirt Digger. Debbie is the first loneliest girl in school who sits and digs in the dirt every day during her recess. And Laura decides to make herself feel better by picking on Debbie and walks over to her. She can't think of anything to say though, and Debbie bluntly tells her that Laura doesn't have any friends, and Laura says that Debbie doesn't have any friends either, and Debbie then tells Laura that she'll be her friend if she eats a bug. Laura is of course weirded out by this, and she rebuffs the idea, but Debbie tells her that birds eat bugs all the time, and that people in other countries do so as well, and she is tired of not having any friends, and she swallows the bug that Debbie gives her whole. Debbie asks her if she chewed, and Laura says that she didn't, she swallowed it whole. And Debbie says that's good, because if she chewed, then the bugs couldn't lay their eggs. Laura then walks back to the building and seems to not be able to remember exactly what just happened. She thinks that she might have eaten a bug, but she says she would never do that, and her stomach starts to flutter at the thought of eating a bug. But little does she know, it starts to flutter for a couple dozen more reasons as well. At least she'll have some new friends soon. This story has always intrigued me because I don't quite know what Debbie's motives are for getting Laura to eat the bug. It seems that she wants the bugs to lay eggs in her stomach so that she can also have friends, so we can assume that Debbie has some bugs in her stomach as well. Debbie is also characterized as having a blank stare and almost seeming lifeless behind the eyes. She also acts a lot weirder than like your typical weird elementary school kid. Like, don't get me wrong, there were always some weird kids at recess and I was probably one of them. But Debbie seems a lot stranger than what you'd expect. My theory is that the bug that she gave Laura is a sort of parasite that will hijack her brain, and maybe that same thing has already happened to Debbie and that's why she's lifeless behind the eyes. That would explain her fascination with bugs and also explain the fact that she spends all recess digging in the dirt. It seems like she has her bug instinct still and can't quite fit in with everybody else. Parasites often hijack the nervous systems of other animals to spread themselves even further, and that would fit with what happens in the story. Like I said, David Lubar is great at creating interesting lore in stories that are only a couple pages long. If you have any theories of any of the stories that I've talked about in this video, then please let me know. I would love to hear your ideas. Throwaways is a really short story. This one starts with our main kid being thrown out by his dad. He says that he played with his dad's autographed Yankees baseball card, and his dad was so mad that he threw him in the trash and took him out to the curb. The kid just stays in the trash all night and is picked up by the garbage truck the next day, but he says that it isn't so bad, and he's brought to the dump and put in a massive pile of garbage, and he climbs out of the pile and some workers find him. They think it's ridiculous that someone would throw out a perfectly good kid, so they hose him off and bring him to a flea market. They put him next to a sofa and a lamp, and an older couple stops by to look at him, and they give the seller a couple bucks and decide to take the kid home. The story ends with the main kid saying that he likes his new home and that his new owners are nice, and he says that they don't own any autographed baseball cards, and if they did, he would make sure not to play with them. The entire time I read this, I could only think of a part from the movie Better Off Dead with John Cusack. There's a part where he ends up in a dumpster and two garbage men say, "Who throws away a perfectly good white kid like that?" I have to believe that that line inspired this story. It's definitely a funny way to play to the whole being thrown out trope that is used in a lot of kids' book. I remember reading this picture book when I was a little kid about a kid who was super ungrateful about getting this little stuffed teddy bear. He goes to bed all angry, but then either has a dream or something like that where he's given to a large teddy bear who doesn't want the kid and has to experience what it feels like to be an unwanted toy. This story has kind of a similar vibe, except there isn't really any moral or lesson, and it's just played completely straight, which is really funny. No one seems to view him as an actual kid, and they just treat him like an object. It's just a goofy little story. Touch the Bottom is about a kid and his friend Joey who are camping at Green Hill Lake. The legend is that the center of the lake doesn't have a bottom to it. Our main kid and Joey are determined to see if that's actually true. Joey dives under the water for a while and emerges holding some mud in his hands, and he shows it to the other kid, who calls him out on his lie, and he says that he must have brought the mud with him, and Joey relents and pulls out a plastic bag full of mud that he carried with him on the way down. But the other kid gets an idea and takes the bag of mud and he empties it and fills it with air, and he says he's going to touch the bottom, and he starts to swim down. When he runs out of air, he takes a big breath from the bag filled with air and then keeps swimming further and further down. His lungs are starting to burn and he still can't see the bottom, and it goes much further down than he ever thought. And then he sees something pale below him, and he swims further down and comes face to face with a bizarre creature. He says it has 4 limbs that end in tentacles, and it has large eyes with dozens of pupils that stare at him and study him. He can tell that this is an intelligent creature, and he says it's 3 to 4 times the size of a regular human. Upon seeing him, the creature lets out a large breath of what looks like mud and then swims back down to where it came from. Our main kid is now out of air and he makes his way back to the surface. He reaches the top and gasps for air. Joey asks him what he saw, and he says that he didn't see anything. He doesn't want to share. He knows that the creatures at the bottom must be just like him and Joey. They were trying to find the bottom, and the creatures were trying to find the surface, and they both had failed. The story ends with Joey and our main kid swimming back to the shore, and the main kid wonders about the world down below with the creatures that breathe mud. He hopes that the creature that makes it to the surface first is a good kid, just like he is. This one never really creeped me out, but it always intrigued me. We know that there are bizarre creatures that live in the depths of the ocean, and we also know that there are like thousands of creatures that we haven't even discovered yet. I like the idea that the creatures down below most likely have the same legend of the lake, but they are trying to get to the surface. It's also a nice touch to have our kid recognize the eyes of the creature as being intelligent and sentient, similar to humans. This one is just a very inventive story that I'm sure would get to some people that are afraid of the ocean or sea creatures. I don't really have that fear, but I also think that I don't know much about the ocean. I'm sure that if I knew a lot more, I would be a lot more afraid. The genie of the necklace starts with a girl named Karen and her friend fighting over an old necklace at an antique shop. Eventually, Karen's friend relates and lets her take the necklace, and it's silver and made out of tiny links with a green gem on it. That night, Karen rubs the gem and a genie pops out of the necklace, only this genie is super freaky looking. He's green and has long claws and seems like he wants to hurt Karen. She realizes that the necklace is what's protecting her. She asks him what he'll do to her if she takes the necklace off, and we don't know what he says, but Karen shudders afterwards and makes sure that she is never going to take the necklace off. She asks the genie what he wants in return for granting her wishes, and he says that he just wants a tiny piece of gold every day. Karen wants to test the limits of her power over the genie, whose name is Yzma, and she negotiates and says that she'll give him a tiny piece of silver each day instead. He agrees and asks her where he can take the silver from, and she says that she can take it from anywhere because she'll just wish for more silver in the future. Karen is excited about her new powers. She wishes for a perfect strawberry, and Yzma brings it to her, and she wishes to be somewhere warm and sunny, and he teleports her to a tropical paradise. She wishes for a mansion, a penthouse, and everything else that she could want. She starts to use her power to mess with people. She turns all of her teachers into frogs, and all of the boys in the school into snakes. She gets bored with that though and turns them all back. She's kind of like remarkably mean-spirited about the whole thing. One day she's out laying in the sun and she notices something odd. There is a spot on her chest that isn't as tan as the others, and it's the shape of the gemstone that hangs from the necklace. Karen is confused at first, but then she realizes what's happening. Yzma is simply taking his tiny piece of silver every day, and he's taking a link from her necklace every single day. It's getting shorter and shorter and will eventually be gone, and she calls Yzma and demands that he take the silver from somewhere else, but he says that they had a deal. She asks him again what he'd do to her if she removed the necklace, and he tells her, and we don't know what he says, but the story ends with the line, "First she shuddered, then she screamed." This is definitely an interesting take on the idea of a genie. I think most of us today would picture the genie from Aladdin in most cases, but having this creepy green monster looking thing that is dead set on ripping its summoner apart is really cool. Another line that is easy to miss is that the owner of the antique shop sells the necklace for only $12. Karen is shocked to see that it's so cheap, and I wonder if the owner knows what they have and just wants to get rid of it, or maybe they're working with the genie. It's just another cool mystery. Alexander Watches a Play is another dive into existential horror, and this one is another one of my absolute favorites. Alexander and his mother head to the community theater to see the last show of the season, and he is not happy about this and would rather be anywhere else. The director stands in front of the stage and introduces their last play of the season. It's called Alexander Watches a Play. Alexander sits up in his seat, because he's intrigued now, and he sees an actor that looks like him enter the scene, and he sits down in a seat, just like Alexander's, with his mom next to him. And then in the play, an actor playing the director enters the stage inside of the stage and announces that they will be performing Alexander Watches a Play. The actors on the stage see another stage that performs the same thing, and this continues on forever. Alexander is completely fixated, and it goes so deep that he can't even see the end anymore. And then he hears the actors in the deepest part of the play say, "Watch out, the balcony is falling," and he hears a crash. The balconies crash and fall on all of the Alexanders in the play, moving from the deepest down up to Alexander himself. He watches as the version of himself on the stage in front of him hears the balcony is about to crash, and the stage Alexander gets up to leave, but freezes as he looks back at the original Alexander, and he yells at his stage version to get out of the way and calls him stupid. The balcony falls down on the stage Alexander, and the real Alexander hears someone say that the theater balcony is about to crash. He gets up to leave and turns around and is stunned to see another version of himself staring at him and telling him to leave. It's like he is part of his own play, and there are more versions of him stretching backwards behind him infinitely. He is mesmerized by this, and even though the version of himself in the theater behind him calls him stupid and tells him to run, he is too late and the balcony crashes on him, killing him. Like I said, this one is just very existential. I love how it holds its final surprise for the very end. The idea that he is seeing an endless amount of plays being performed of him going to the play is cool already, but then having him be watched by another version of himself and like having infinite versions stretching backwards is super cool too. It kind of plays on the idea that you might not be the real version of you, you might just be part of like some simulated reality or play. There was an episode of Black Mirror called Joan is Awful that did some similar stuff, and I really liked that episode. Miss Barunki is the shortest story in the book, and it's one that I've talked about before. It's about an elementary school kid who absolutely hates his teacher, Miss Barunki. She doesn't seem to like any of the kids as well, and they all just try to make each other's lives miserable. It's the last day of the school year, and Miss Barunki is retiring, and she says that all of the kids will finally be out of her life, but she will make sure that the kids never forget her. The story ends with our main kid leaving school and being happy that he won't have to deal with her ever again. The last paragraph of the story is hard to explain without just reading it, so I'm going to do that. And she was wrong. No matter what she said, I knew I wouldn't ever think of her again. As sure as the sky is blue, as sure as water is wet, as sure as 2 times 3 is 7, Miss Barunki was out of my life for good. I love the idea that the teacher just completely screws over the kids by teaching them the wrong way to do math. Like, it's such a weird little petty thing, and it's just funny that a teacher would get her revenge by just teaching them incorrect things. It's a great little story. Mergo Pana is an interesting story. It's about a kid named Brendan who is living on a remote island with his dad, and his dad is studying the native language of a tribe of indigenous people that live on the island. Brendan brings a bunch of useless plastic jewelry to the island with him to trade with the natives. They are interested in his stuff, but they don't really have anything that he wants. His dad talks with the leader of the group and tries to understand the language. Brendan and his dad find a statue that the islanders have made of a giant creature that looks like a cross between a cockroach, a lobster, and a fish. The statue has sharp teeth and giant claws, and Brendan's dad says nothing that large could ever actually exist. If you don't know, there is kind of a limit to how big something can be before gravity affects it too much to survive. That's why elephants are about like the biggest a land animal can be, and we don't really see anything larger than them, but whales are much bigger than elephants because they don't have to deal with gravity as much since they obviously live in the ocean. This means that something like Godzilla or the Cloverfield monster couldn't actually exist because the weight of gravity would just render it completely immobile. That's just a fun little fact, but anyways, the next day, the villagers start to sound an alarm and they all gather in a cave. They invite Brendan and his dad into the cave with them, and Brendan and his dad know that they are cowering in fear of the monster. But Brendan and his dad decide to stay out and observe what happens, because they know that it is physically impossible for a creature that big to exist, so they aren't really worried about the situation. Then they start to see the ocean bubbling, and they hear it chattering and see thousands of tiny creatures emerging from the ocean. They're the same creature that the statues portray. They have sharp teeth and pincers and move very fast, and Brendan and his dad try to run, but they're too slow and they're killed by the tiny creatures. I had totally forgotten about this one, and I actually really liked the twist at the end. I think most people would expect that a massive creature would rise from the ocean, with Brendan and his dad like paying for their own hubris, thinking that nothing that big could exist. Instead, they end up being right about the massive creature not existing, but the threat ends up being worse with thousands of tiny little ones. I hate bugs, and honestly, a lot of sea creatures gross me out because they look like giant bugs, so this story just gives me the heebie-jeebies. Eat Your Vegetables is another funny story. It seems that this book is switching back and forth between kind of funny and creepy stories. I think the later books kind of focused more on the creepy stories, but this one tries to have kind of more of a mix in it. Ed is a kid that doesn't want to eat his vegetables, and his mom tells him that if he doesn't eat them, something bad will happen. He throws the vegetables away while his mom isn't looking and takes the trash out to the curb, getting away with not eating them. He then goes to relax and watch some TV, and outside, some mice start to smell the delicious vegetables and start to chew their way through the garbage bag. Noticing the mice, a cat from across the street heads over to get its dinner. Seeing the cats, a neighborhood dog starts to bark and tries to run after it. It breaks the leash that it's on and it runs into the street. A man driving in a car down the street sees the dog jump out in front of him and swerves to avoid it, hitting a telephone pole. The airbag goes off and the man inside the car is alright, but the pole that he knocked over is connected to the cable line that goes to Ed's house. Ed goes to watch TV and the TV won't turn on, and he groans and asks his mom why the TV won't turn on, and she says that she told him something bad would happen if he didn't eat his vegetables. So just a funny story to illustrate an unlikely cause and effect chain that ends in an inconvenience for our main character. This one really reminded me of something out of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark with one of its more funny stories. Inquire Within is about two friends, Delilah and Quinn, who find a poster that advertises to pay people who turn in any witches that they can find. The girls think this is silly, but they go to the address anyway, and they find a nice woman who tells them that she will pay $500 per witch. She says that they don't even need to bring the witches to them, they can just make a list of all the women they suspect to be witches, and the girls are ecstatic about this. They don't believe in witches, of course, but they know a couple of mean old ladies that would fit the bill. They spend the rest of the day coming up with names for their list that they plan to bring back to the woman the next morning. After Quinn leaves, Delilah decides to take the list to the woman herself so she doesn't have to share the profits with Quinn. She also puts Quinn's name on the list so that if Quinn tries to turn in a list without Delilah, she will be accused of being a witch and think that the woman is crazy. Delilah brings the list to the old woman, who thanks her, and Delilah asks her why she's so interested in hunting witches. The woman says that she isn't interested in hunting witches at all. None of them are. And Delilah looks around and sees some other women in the shadows of the dark shop. The woman says that they are interested in finding the kind of people that would turn witches in. Delilah tries to get up and the woman cackles at her, and Delilah's legs have become useless, and she sees the witches emerge from the darkness laughing at her. She tries to say something, but she can't move her tongue, and she grows very sleepy and falls unconscious. The next day, Quinn heads over to Delilah's house and finds the cops there. They say that she is missing, and they ask Quinn what they did together the day before. She says that they just watched movies and hung out. No need to mention them doing anything as silly as hunting for witches. And that's where the story ends. If you've watched my other video about the other Weenies book, then this one will probably sound familiar to the Galactic Zap story. They share the same idea that a kid thinks they're doing something to help someone when really they're really being targeted themselves. I love stories about witches. I read Roald Dahl's Witches book when I was in elementary school, and I've always found witches fascinating. The Witch by Robert Eggers is one of my favorite movies of all time, and I need to make a video just about like witch media sometime because I think that would be a lot of fun. If you'd be interested in that, then let me know. 3 is a story that deals with something that we've probably all experienced. When your mom or dad tells you to stop doing something and they start to count all menacingly like 1, 2, but then you always chicken out and stop what you're doing before they get to 3. The story follows a kid named Dennis who asks his friend what happens when their parents get to 3, and none of them know the answer. None of them have gotten that far, and Dennis decides to see what happens, but he keeps chickening out before his mom actually gets to 3. Eventually, he tells his 2 friends to physically hold him back the next time his mom calls out to him. They do, and he tries to wriggle away as his mom starts counting, and she finally gets to 3, and when she says it, the word echoes loudly throughout the entire street. Everything is just dead silent afterwards, but then the kids start to hear the sounds of doors slamming all over the street. They see Dennis's parents walk out of the house and slam the door, heading down the street, and all of the other parents in all the other houses do the same thing. All of the adults walk away, abandoning their children, and Dennis tries to get their attention, but they don't seem to recognize him. They just stare straight ahead and keep walking, leaving all the kids behind. Dennis's friends get angry at at him and they start to chase after him, and Dennis opens his mouth to yell for his mom, but he stops himself knowing that no one will answer. This is another story that deals with abandonment in an interesting way. I like the idea that only one kid needs to let his mom get to 3 for all of the parents to walk out. It's like this unspoken rule that just signals to the parents that the kids aren't worth raising anymore. I also just felt the story in my soul. Up until recently, I worked for an after-school program at my local middle school, and I would essentially babysit a bunch of middle school kids, and so many of them just refused to listen to a single thing that I would say. So I could personally feel the frustration of the parents, and the idea of just finally snapping and giving up was super relatable. I don't work there anymore. Fat face is one that is honestly incredibly messed up and made even worse in that nothing paranormal even happens in it. It's about a kid that everyone calls fat face because he is constantly eating, and he says he can't help himself and gets made fun of a lot. One day, while eating a candy bar and walking home from school, a kid named Ronald snatches the candy bar out of his hand, and he calls him fat face and starts to taunt him. He opens the candy bar and starts to eat it, which makes the other kid angry. The main kid tells Ronald to give the candy bar back, and Ronald taunts him and says that he'll have to catch him. He takes off down the street and just lightly jogs, and the main kid can barely keep up, and Ronald runs behind an old abandoned house. The two continue their chase into the backyard, which is filled with old junk, and Ronald taunts the main kid and starts running backwards, still easily outpacing him. Ronald then trips on an oil drum and knocks over a bunch of junk in the backyard. He ends up painfully pinned to the ground with a heavy oil drum on his legs and a metal bar pinning his neck and body face down. The candy bar has also turned into a sticky mess all over his face, and he tells the main kid to get help, and the main kid starts to slowly walk away, taunting Ronald and saying that he's going as fast as he can. As the kid walks away slowly, he hears Ronald scream louder and louder, and he smiles, knowing exactly what he's screaming about. You see, Ronald wasn't just pinned face down in the dirt. His head was resting right next to an anthill of red fire ants, and Ronald screams as the ants painfully bite him as they eat the candy off of his face. This one is just absolutely brutal. I get that Ronald was a total jerk, but having your face eaten off by fire ants is just straight up torture, and the fact that the main kid knows what's happening and just takes his time to torture the kid is honestly really messed up. I'm kind of glad this story is in here though, because I was worried that nothing in this book would be as painful as some of the stuff in the last one, like the clown face carving or the yesterday tomorrow thing with all the broken bones, but this story sounded so painful. The Soda Fountain is about a kid named Ben Jensen who heads to his favorite soda shop, and it's one of those old-fashioned soda places where the workers make the soda from the syrup and the seltzer water. They do it all from scratch. Ben walks in like he always does and gets a cherry vanilla soda from Mr. Paulson, the nice man that owns the shop. The grill in the back sputters and sparks, and Mr. Paulson says that he needs to get it fixed one of these days, and Ben says that he always says that. Ben finishes his drink and leaves the soda shop, and a girl on the street who is walking with her mom comes up to him. She asks him what he was doing in the soda shop, and he says he was just getting a soda. He likes giving Mr. Paulson his business because he seems to be the only customer. The girl says that Mr. Paulson died 2 years ago when the grill caused an electrical fire that burned the entire shop down. Ben thinks this is ridiculous, and the girl's mother asks her who she's talking to. She tells her mother that she's talking to Ben Jensen, and her mother scolds her, and she says not to say something so ridiculous. Everyone knows that Ben Jensen died in the fire at the soda shop 2 years ago. Ben thinks this is strange, and he heads back in for another soda. So just a classic case of a spirit not knowing they are dead. To be honest, getting to drink delicious soda day after you die doesn't sound like that bad of an afterlife. If that's what comes after death, then I'm a lot less scared of dying. I remember the story pretty well. It's a twist that a lot of adult readers can probably see coming from a mile away, or it might feel cliche, but the first time I read this, it blew my mind. A lot of these stories act as a way to introduce a bunch of young readers to classic horror tropes in interesting ways. Sniffles is about a kid named Norman who gets the sniffles one day, and his mom is really concerned about it, so she takes him to the doctor to test for allergies. Norman isn't too excited about this since his friend did allergy testing before and it was not a pleasant experience for him. When Norman and his mom get to the doctor's office, they notice that the doctor, Dr. Grand, drives a super nice luxury car. During his checkup, Dr. Grand asks Norman how popular he is, how many people he sees on a regular basis, and what sports he plays. Norman answers, but is confused as to how this is going to help him figure out what he's allergic to, and the doctor says not to worry about it, and then gives him a single shot in the arm, and Norman thinks this is weird since they didn't do any actual allergy testing. Norman's sniffles go away, but all of his friends and classmates start to sneeze around him all the time. He eventually realizes that the shot that the doctor gave him made other people allergic to him, and he heads back back to the doctor's office to confront Dr. Grand. Dr. Grand is getting into his nice car when Norman walks up to him and asks him why he gave him that allergy shot, and Dr. Grand says that it's not very often that someone as popular as Norman comes in to do allergy testing, and he wanted to make sure that as many people as possible would be affected by the allergy shot. He gave Norman the shot to give all the other kids allergies so they would come into the doctor's office so he could make more money. Norman says that's really messed up, but Dr. Grand doesn't seem to care. The story ends with Dr. Grand driving away and Norman revealing that he rubbed poison oak on his car door handle, hoping to get him back just a little bit for all the allergies that he has caused over the years. I don't have much to say about this one other than that the twist is pretty fun. The doctor being completely self-serving and wanting to make sure Norman is super popular before making everyone allergic to him is an interesting take. Sidewalk chalk is a quick little story. It's about two friends, Cindy and Tracy, that find some sidewalk chalk in Cindy's garage. Tracy wants the two of them to draw some things on the driveway, but Cindy doesn't want to because she's a bad artist. Tracy draws a flower and then a fish and then hands the chalk over to Cindy, and Cindy reluctantly draws a super big dog because she thinks that if she draws it bigger, it'll look better somehow. After she finishes her drawing, they find a flower on the ground. Tracy's drawing has come to life, and the drawing of the fish turns into a real fish that starts flopping around on the ground. Then Tracy screams and asks Cindy what she drew, and Cindy says that she drew a puppy, but Tracy says that it was actually a dinosaur. The drawing didn't really look like a puppy, and now it is turned into a dinosaur that eats the fish, that is flopping around, and starts to chase after the girls. The story ends with the two of them running away, and Cindy affirming to herself that she is, in fact, a bad artist. This one is pretty typical. Drawing something and then having it come to life is a trope that shows up in a lot of media. I like the idea that the drawings turn into perfect representations of what they were supposed to be, though. I was expecting Cindy's drawing to be like some deformed giant chalk monster, but the fact that it turns into a real dinosaur because that's what it looks like the most is a fun way to do it. It's a pretty forgettable story, but it's also perfectly enjoyable. Don't Ever Let It Touch the Ground is about a kid and his younger brother named Felix. Felix has grabbed their dad's American flag from his closet and is playing around with it. Our main kid gets mad at him and tells him to not ever let the flag touch the ground. Felix starts to slowly lower the flag to the ground, mocking the main kid, and he tries to tell him to stop, but Felix lets the flag touch the ground. He angrily grabs the flag from Felix and hides it in his dad's closet again. That night, the main kid thinks that he needs to teach Felix a lesson, so he goes and grabs the flag and decides to drape it over himself and wear it like a kind of hood almost. His plan is to wake Felix up and scare him and make him never disrespect the flag again because he's like a flag ghost or something. As he is on his way to scare Felix, he hears two voices from behind him. And he turns around and finds two Revolutionary War soldiers with ghostly appearances that walk up to him and grab him tightly, and they tell him to never disrespect the flag again. He tries to tell them that Felix was the one who let it touch the ground, and they scold him over trying to pin the blame on someone else. One of the ghosts grabs his jaw so hard that he thinks it might shatter, but the ghosts let him off with a warning. The main kid then folds the flag carefully and puts it on his desk, and he doesn't want to scare Felix anymore, and is just freaked out by the whole situation. The next day, the flag is missing from his desk, and he looks outside and sees Felix playing with it. In the distance, he can hear the sound of Revolutionary War soldiers marching, and he knows that they're going to be coming for him tonight. He knows he isn't safe because if he tries to tell them what really happened, they'll think he's just trying to pin it on Felix again. The story is interesting. I like how it deals with the odd rule of never letting the flag touch the ground and establishes tangible consequences to it. That seems to be a theme with these stories. They attach a consequence to a social taboo. It's a cool way to write a story. It's also funny that the ghost soldiers know like the general area of where the flag touched the ground, but they aren't like all knowing enough to know that it wasn't the main kid that did it. It's a good play on the idea of getting blamed for something that your little brother did. Picking Up is about a kid named John that is cleaning his room, and he starts by picking up the dirty clothes and then moves to some of the toys and games. He says he can't quite remember playing with any of those toys or reading any of the books that he's picking up. He eventually gets his room all picked up, and two other kids walk into the room, and one of them points at John and says that his new model is awesome. The other kid says that this new model picks up clothes really well, but he is currently saving up for a model with more memory. The older kid presses a button on John's chest and everything goes dark. He then wakes up and starts cleaning the room all over again now that it's messy. He says that he can't remember why he's cleaning the room, but sometimes he thinks that cleaning is all there ever is. So John is essentially a robot that solely exists to clean the room up and do nothing else. He gets turned off and can't remember anything until it's time to clean the room again. His entire existence is cleaning the room. I was shocked when I read this story because it's pretty much the exact concept behind the show Severance, which is my favorite show right now. It's just a cool, unique concept for a super quick story story, and one that provokes a lot of thought and theorizing. Head of the Class is an interesting story. It's about a kid named Rusty that has some struggle with his tests at school. He gets bad grades and wishes that he knew all of the answers to everything. His teacher hands him back a test that he got an F on. The next day, Rusty's class has another spelling test, and the teacher reads out words and asks them to spell them and write them down. She says barrel, and Rusty writes down the answer as B-A-R-R-L-E, and the teacher then collects the tests. On his way home from school, Rusty passes a store called the Pickle Barrel and realizes that he got the spelling wrong on his test. He goes back to school the next day ready to receive his F, but is shocked to find that he has been given a perfect score. He is confused by this, but certainly isn't complaining, and on his way home from school, he passes by the same store, but the sign now says the Pickle Barrel, barrel spelt B-A-R-R-L-E. The next day, he has a test about American presidents, and he is asked who the 15th president was. Rusty puts down Abraham Lincoln and is upset when he goes home and finds that Lincoln was actually the 16th president. He goes to school the next day and finds out that he got a perfect 100% on the test and is confused again. He pulls out a penny and doesn't recognize the face on it. It's supposed to be Lincoln, but it has Grant's face on it. His friend tells him that of course Grant's face is on the penny. Grant was the president of the Civil War instead of Lincoln. And Rusty realizes that his mistakes are coming true when his teacher reads them. He has to write an essay that night for homework about what he does when he isn't at school, and he makes sure to do it all correctly with a spell checker so that he doesn't get anything wrong. He prints out his 2 copies of the essay, one for himself and one to turn into the teacher. He submits his essay and has his friend look over the copy, and his friend says that there aren't any mistakes except for a tiny one that Rusty didn't catch. Rusty wrote that when he gets home from school, his parents are gone and he doesn't have anybody. The issue is that he wrote anybody as 2 separate words, anybody. He panics as his teacher reads his essay and he feels himself drop to the floor. His body has now disappeared, leaving him as a bodiless head. His teacher comes by and returns his essay with a perfect score, and she pats him on the head and everyone leaves the classroom. Rusty can't leave, of course, and is left in the dark as a useless head, and he says that he thinks this might not be so bad, but then his nose starts to itch. This is another story that is probably trying to be funny, but the idea of being stuck as a disembodied head is terrifying to me. Just being stuck there and unable to move sounds like an absolute nightmare. Although the outcome is horrifying, the way that we get there was really fun. The idea that all the answers are turned into the correct ones and then change the world around him is really clever and something that I don't know if I've seen before. It's a good story. Halfway Home is all about Zeno's paradox. Zeno was a philosopher that posited that motion isn't real. That's like a super oversimplified explanation, but it's the one that the story uses, and Amy's teacher has been talking about this during class, but she completely zoned out. Amy decides to take a shortcut home and ends up on a gravel lot walking towards a stop sign. She remembers that her teacher said that Zeno's paradox was something like this: in order to get somewhere, you have to be halfway there first. But before you can be halfway there, you have to be halfway to halfway first, and before that, you have to be halfway to halfway to halfway, and so on. And Amy thinks about this as she is halfway to the stop sign. She then notices that she's been walking for a while and is still halfway to the stop sign. She thought she'd be a lot closer. She realizes that she is caught in a paradox and is always halfway to the stop sign. It starts to grow dark and she isn't moving any closer. The story ends with Amy trying to understand the paradox and find a way to get out of it. She says that she will have plenty of time to think about it. This one is short, but it plays with the cool idea of Zeno's paradox and always being halfway to something. It reminds me of the feeling that I get in a lot of my dreams where I'm trying to run somewhere and it just feels like I'm not moving at all. That's how I imagine Amy feels as she walks in place forever. The story makes sure to mention the sharp gravel digging into her feet to just make it that much more painful and scary. This one was just another good story with an interesting angle that I hadn't really seen before. Hop to It is about 2 kids named Carl and Morty that are tormenting a poor little grasshopper. They find that if they stomp next to it, it'll jump away, and they take turns scaring it and chasing it and then stomping and scaring it all over again and making it jump. Eventually, Carl misplaces his stomp and squishes the grasshopper. The 2 boys call the bug stupid and start to try to find another one when they find they don't recognize where they're at. It's an unfinished street that they've never been on before. Then they turn around and see a massive grasshopper behind them. It stomps on Carl, crushing him to death. Morty turns and tries to run away, but the bug is too big and stomps on him as well. both kids squished just like the little grasshopper. This is a theme that's used a lot in these stories, the idea of there always being something bigger than you. The Bobbing for Dummies story from earlier is actually really similar to this one, definitely terrifying as always. Nothing Like a Hammock is one that has stuck with me for a long time. A kid is going to his friend Cody's house, and he knocks on the door and a man answers it. He's wearing sunglasses while he's inside for some reason, and he says that he's Cody's dad. Cody isn't back from school yet, so he tells the kid he can wait in the backyard for him to get back, and he tells him he can stretch out in the hammock. The kid goes to the backyard and finds the white hammock in between two trees, and he lays comfortably in it. He then hears Cody saying, "I'm home, but something is wrong." Cody's voice is coming from the other side of the fence. He isn't in Cody's backyard at all, and he tries to get up, but he finds that he is stuck to the hammock and can't move. The owner of the house quietly opens the door to the backyard and comes creeping out, and he is crawling on his hands and feet. Two more sets of hands and feet extend from slits on the side of his shirt, and his sunglasses fall off and reveal unhuman eyes. The man is some sort of fleshy, humanoid spider, and his eyes are those of a spider, and he crawls towards the kid, having caught him in his web. The kid continues to struggle, but it's no use. He's completely stuck, and that is where the story ends. The idea of this weird fleshy spider thing is pretty horrifying to me. I am terrified of spiders, and this story plays on all of those fears really well. I also like the detail that the hammock is actually just a web. I think that's a really cool idea. I've said this before, but a lot of these stories typically involve awful kids getting what they deserve, but the main kid in this one does absolutely nothing wrong. I mean, I guess he shouldn't have trusted the stranger and gone into his backyard, but that's a terrible fate for such a small mistake. Puncturation is about a girl named Connie who is going with her friend Nicole to get her ears pierced. The lady at the piercing place puts 2 red dots on Connie's earlobes. She pierces one ear and Nicole gasps and looks horrified. Connie grabs a mirror. She sees a white fungus growing from her new piercing, and the piercer says that there is sometimes an infection. The fungus starts to grow, taking over Connie's entire ear, and she tries to rip it off, but it just sticks to her hand, growing all over her at this point. The fungus starts to cover her mouth and nose, and she starts to suffocate. She looks around in panic and then suddenly wakes up, and it turns out she had fainted when her ear was pierced, and the piercing lady wakes her up and does the other ear, and the 2 girls leave. As Connie and Nicole are walking away, Nicole points at Connie's ear with a look of concern. Connie asks what's wrong, and Nicole says that it just isn't quite centered. Connie says that she can live with that. There are a lot worse things that could happen. I love the image of the infection growing and taking over Connie's body. It's actually pretty terrifying, and the idea of being suffocated from this bizarre fungus is really creepy. I can see why they didn't fully commit to the idea and do the fake out though. I think in some of the later books they would have committed to something as gruesome as that, but it seems like they're a little tamer with a lot of things that happen in these earlier books so as to not scar a bunch of children for life. The Chipper is about a kid whose friend invites him over to clean his yard and use his wood chipper. The main kid is scared of the chipper and doesn't want to use it, and his friend calls him a chicken, and the main kid ends up cutting his hand on the machine. Now, with a taste of his blood, the chipper starts to show up outside the kid's window, and it stalks him around like a predator looking for its prey. Eventually, the kid confronts the chipper and feeds it a whole bunch of sand in order to break the machine, and it works. He has killed the chipper. After a couple days, however, the main kid's dad says that he bought the chipper from his friend's dad and is going to fix it up. The main kid is concerned about this, and his dad ends up cutting his finger on the chipper just like he did. Knowing that the chipper will be out for his dad's blood and not his anymore, he decides to leave it be and let his dad deal with the evil wood chipper. This one feels very similar to the unforgiving tree where the tree was trying to kill the kid. I guess this one is a little bit different because the main kid didn't do anything wrong in this situation. The chipper just gets a taste for his blood, and that's why he ends up in this strange situation. Mugshots is about a kid named Vince and his 2 friends that are out hiking in the woods. They end up getting lost and are running out of water, and they come across an old cabin where no one is home, and they decide to break in. Inside the cabin, they find a sink and a bunch of mugs on the counter. Each mug has a hand-painted picture of an animal on it. One of the friends grabs the bear mug and begins to drink the water, and another friend grabs the snake mug, and the last friend grabs the rabbit mug. When they drink out of their mugs, they all turn into their respective animals. They're still sentient, but they're all confused and angry, and the bear friend chases the rabbit friend around and ends up smashing their mugs, which turns them all back into humans. Vince, seeing the chaos around him and having not yet drunk from a mug, grabs one with no picture on it to be safe. He drinks from the mug and looks down to see that he has completely disappeared. The mug has turned him into nothing. He tries to tell his friends to smash his mug, but they think he's already left since they can't see him, and the story ends with Vince trapped in the cabin as nothing while his friends leave to go find him, not knowing he was there the entire time. This one had a twist that I wasn't really expecting. I was thinking it would be like a Goldilocks situation where all of the animals came back and killed the kids. Them turning into their respective animals is much more in line from what I would expect from these books. The idea of like disappearing or being turned into nothing is pretty freaky to me. I've talked about it in the past, like about media that involves ghosts who are left behind, and that concept is eerie to me. The idea that everyone around you could move on leaving you alone is just very sad. Forgotten Monsters is the last story in this book, and I want to read it word for word because it's pretty short and I think it's really clever. Things grow dull in the Hall of Forgotten Monsters. I can tell that I'm close to fading completely away. Nobody believes in me, and even worse, nobody fears me anymore. There was a time, what a time it was, when the very thought of me sent shivers of terror down the spines of even the bravest children. We are a sad and miserable group here in the Hall of Forgotten Monsters. Across the way, I can see the Stegalith. What a fine creation he was, unstoppable, crushing everything beneath his terrible stone body. How folks must have trembled at the thought of him. And the Drake, huddled together in that corner. There was a time when mothers could make their children behave, scaring them with the tales of the Drake. No more. We are forgotten monsters. We are unfeared. There must be a way to return. Once, every child knew of me. It was I who rode the moonlight through their closed windows and carried them away if their minds even held one thought of me. The name of the Wander Band was whispered from child to child. Don't think about him, they warned. If you think about him when he's near, he'll get you. He'll snatch you right from your bed. It's best to never think his name. That was me. Those were the glory times. They said I held 1,000 heads, each with 1,000 teeth. This is true. They said those I stole suffered a lifetime of terror during each instant I held them in my grasp. This is true too. They have forgotten me. My place has been taken by other terrors, the vampire and the zombie, the mummy, the boogeyman, but I have a plan. There is a way to return. It might not seem possible. I know that the Stegalith and the Drake would say that it couldn't be done. No one has ever returned once belief has begun to fade, but I have a plan. I will find a teller of tales. I will search for one whose mind I can enter. I will slip my story into his mind and have him tell the world. They will then fear me, and I will no longer fade. I will grow strong again. I have found the one. He is ready. It is easy. I am in his mind. I will begin with words that will draw the reader into the tale. He is used to ideas coming from him out of nowhere. He will not question this gift. He will just tell my story. And the children will read about the Wander Band. They will whisper my name and fear me, and I will be real again. I know the perfect words. I have been thinking about them for many centuries. I will whisper the words now, and he will write them down. Things grow dull in the Hall of Forgotten Monsters. I can tell that I am close to fading away completely. Good, he is writing the story. Soon you will read it. Fear me, think of me, whisper my name, I will return. So I think that story is super cool, like the meta-narrative of this monster giving the idea to David Lubar, the author. Now we all know about him, so he'll come back and be real and harass us. It's a cool little meta story to end on. And those are all the stories in The Curse of the Campfire Weenies. I mentioned earlier, but I think this might be, in my opinion, the weakest collection of stories in the series. I really love a lot of these, but a lot of them kind of lack the punch that some of the later books have. I love this series and would love to make more videos like this if this video does all right. These videos tend to not get a ton of views because the subject is just so niche, but I have a ton of fun making them and would just love to make more. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe if you haven't yet, and to subscribe to my second channel that will be linked in the description. I talk about horror literature for the most part on this channel, and my second channel is for a bunch of other random topics that don't fit in that niche. If you're interested in supporting me further, then you can become a channel member for just $3 a month. Channel members get early access to all videos, exclusive videos, and access to my monthly book club where we all choose a book to read and talk about. A massive thank you to all my members that you are seeing on the screen right now, and an extra special thank you to all my gold tier members: Amanda Mapes, Lucas Fernando, Chris Lamb, Ezra, Silent Trails, Blue Radio Media, Coco Boko, Tyler the Leper, Vic's Corner, Lexi, B, and Pyrocat. Your support really does mean the world to me. You guys are awesome. Thank you again to everybody watching this video. Go watch my other videos if you haven't seen them yet. I do iceberg videos. I do all sorts of other horror media videos that are really fun. But I'll catch you in the next one. See ya.